Hello and welcome to Pathways, where you are invited to join me for a visit with leaders in personal development and cultural evolution. This is your host, Paul O'Brien. These days, we are constantly encouraged to make the most of our time, to work harder, to have more focus, to stop procrastinating, optimize, to be happy, creative, and successful requires discipline. The most important thing is to be efficient with every precious minute. But what if all that advice was wrong? And letting the brain rest and the mind wander isn't a waste of time, but actually essential to our brain's health and well-being. Well, that is the premise of our guest today. And we're going to have a show on the science of the brain with Dr. Joseph Jebelli, author of the book, The Brain at Rest: How the Art and Science of Doing Nothing Can Improve Your Life. Joseph received a PhD in neuroscience from the University College London, then worked as postdoctoral research fellow at the University of Washington. He has written two other books, How the Mind Changed and In Pursuit of Memory. Well, hello, Joseph, and welcome to the Pathway Show.
Hi, Paul. Good to be with you.
This topic of the brain is infinitely interesting, and there's so much stuff happening. It's like we're learning things at such a rapid pace right now. The brain science really is kind of a very exciting frontier. Well, what drew you to neuroscience?
So I've been interested in neuroscience for quite a long time. I remember as a child, I would always, flip open the pages of New Scientist or Scientific American, and I would always look for the article on the brain, the neuroscience article. So I was very interested in it when I was little. Um, and then at university, I was very interested in cell and molecular biology. And I just found nerve cells endlessly fascinating. Like how they generate these electrical signals and how that underpins so much of our experience and our feelings and what and how we think. And I found that really fascinating. And so it was kind of natural for me to then go into neuroscience. And I started off by looking at Parkinson's disease and then Alzheimer's disease, understanding the molecular biology of those diseases, and then it sort of branched out from there. And I've just been like ever, increasingly interested in the workings of the human brain. And it's, as you say, it's neuroscience is wonderful because it's a field still very much in its infancy, and the more we're uncovering, the more we're learning, the more extraordinary and, as I talk about in this book, counterintuitive in many ways, our understanding of the brain is becoming.
Yeah, it's so interesting. The evolution of the brain fascinates me. It's like, I've came out of the software industry back in the 80s, and there comes a time when in a software project you have to make a decision. Are we going to keep patching it and extending it, or should we just start over? Now, evolution does the patch and extend strategy so that all the old parts of the brain, the lizard brain or whatever we want to call it, they never go away and they're always like active in the matrix of our brain. And that seems like that evolution is not the most intelligent design.
No.
It is what it is. And you make the point in your book, you say the brain is an incredibly active organ, even when we don't think it's doing much. And it says it uses an enormous 20% of our body's energy, despite being only 2% of its weight. Wow.
Hmm.
That's that's consuming a lot of energy. And what the heck's it doing with that energy?
Mm. Yeah, it's a really good question. So that's one of the really interesting things about the brain, like what is it doing with that energy? And so, in my latest book, The Brain at Rest, I I've basically, I'm trying to get the message across to people that your brain is an incredibly energetic organ. But what's really interesting is that when you rest And what I mean by that is when you step away from work, step away from a cognitively demanding task and let your brain rest. And this can be in anything, this can be, doing things like just mind wandering, staring out of the window into space, having a 30-minute nap, going on a walk through a park and just listening to the rustling of the leaves, all these things that you find very restful. We have this misconception that the brain is like a muscle and that it's powering down in during those states, but it's not. It's power. If anything, it's powering up, because what happens when you rest is that your brain activates a network that we call the default network, and that's a network that fans out across your brain, and it allows you to think in completely new ways. And we now know that when you activate your default network, your resting brain, with rest, you improve your intelligence, creativity, memory, problem solving abilities, emotional processing, and your long term productivity. It can even reduce your chances of developing neurological diseases like depression and dementia. And so, you know, it's been a really exciting area to study because the default network was only actually discovered in 2001 by
Yeah,
this
it's
extraordinary
amazing.
neurologist, named Marcus Raichle. And but it's only in the last few years that neuroscientists have really begun to flesh out the default network and figure out what our brains are doing when we rest.
So the default network, you can get the impression that the default network is doesn't really do very much. It's like doing nothing, but actually, it's doing quite a lot of things, and we usually define biological entities by what they do. What is the default network do? I mean,
Mm,
how does it use up that energy?
mm. So it's a really good question. So what the default network is essentially doing is it's busily working on problems like beneath the radar, like beneath your conscious awareness. So
Uh-huh.
when you have that 30-minute nap, or you're walking through the park, or you're just, staring out of the window, allowing your mind to drift off, all of the neurons in the default network in that circuitry are firing up. They're becoming very, very busy, and they're essentially solving problems for you. They're making you more creative. They're activating what we call the incubation effect, where you're solving a problem without actually trying to solve the problem. I mean, lots of people have this experience. You're at your desk. You're trying to solve some kind of intractable problem or some work-related problem, and you just can't get it, and your brain sort of feels like it's stuck. And then you go for a walk, and then it just pops into your head. And that's because your default network, your resting brain, has been busily working on the problem without you even being aware of it. And the really interesting thing is that a mountain of new research now shows that, as a general rule, the more time you spend doing nothing, the more time you spend resting, the better it is for your brain. It doesn't matter if you're, a doctor, a train driver,
Now,
a
okay, so what is
student.
doing nothing? What is doing nothing? That's daydreaming? Is that doing nothing? Is meditating doing nothing?
So daydreaming is because that's like a form of mind wandering.
Yeah,
Meditating and so like mindfulness and meditation is a little bit different, because mindfulness and meditation, you know, it, the default network, it's not really about a focused attention on the present.
right,
It's
right.
much more effortless than that.
Uh-huh. So it's a
So
let it go. It's
it's
kind of
about
letting.
letting your mind, it's about letting go.
Right, right. You quote all these experiments in your book. What a fascinating book, by the way. I really enjoyed it. And one time you say engaging in a task dampened the brain, like the dimmer switch turned all the way down, while disengaging from a task stimulated the brain. Now, this goes against a lot of the advice we read in magazines about, well, you've got to keep your brain sharp and you play these games and you know, do these left brain concentration exercises, but you are completely opposed to that approach.
So that's the really
You say that it's
counterintuitive.
actually bad for your brain to
Well, it's
overwork it.
not. Yeah, to overwork it. Yeah, that's the crucial distinction. So it's, it's obviously, it's good to do lots of things and to engage in, some cognitively demanding tasks, of course. But at the moment, all the data suggests that we are all overworking. So globally, overwork now leads to 745,000 deaths a year. 3 in 5 employees report a lack of interest, motivation, and energy. And these numbers are actually, the first, the 745,000 figure is a 29% increase since 2000, and the 3 in 5 employees is an increase of 38% since 2019. So we're actually in a regression in terms of burnout and overwork, even though working conditions are better today than they were in the past. Um, but but the thing is, you're absolutely right. It is mind-boggling. It's kind of nuts that this idea that engaging in a task dampens the brain like a dimmer switch turned all the way down, whilst disengaging actually stimulates the brain like a dimmer switch turned all the way up. I say in the book, it's as counterintuitive as pedaling on a bicycle to slow down and braking to speed up. Um, but that's the really interesting thing, because when Marcus Raichle discovered this in 2001, you know, he had lots of people in brain scanners performing tasks, things like, name as many words beginning with the letter K, or let's memorize all these different things. And for so long, neuroscientists they were so interested in what the brain is doing when we work, when we perform a task, that they actually ignored this background signal, or seemingly background signal, of the resting brain. Because when they weren't performing the task, when they were just resting in the scanner, relaxing, the resting brain, the default network, was screaming with activity, and they would often delete that signal from their data just in order to see more closely what the brain was doing when we work. But now it's becoming clear that not only is that resting brain signal not background noise, but it's the key ingredient to all of our cognitive abilities. And it doesn't matter whether you're a train driver, a doctor, or a student. Whatever task you're performing, you will perform better on that task if you rest beforehand, precisely because you're activating that resting brain network.
And when the brain is resting, I imagine, I mean, I can visualize that there's all of these, you know, neurons firing off or whatever. That's kind of like maybe it's a maintenance thing or, a way for the brain to keep itself in balance or something. You know,
Mm,
you talk about work a lot and about overwork, and the Japanese have a word for dying from working yourself to death called karoshi. But you talk about how overwork changes the brain. Can you speak to that?
mm. Yeah, so overwork does a number of things to our brains, none of which are good. So the first thing it does is that it thins the frontal cortex in the same way that aging does. So it literally makes the brain older than it is. And what's happening there is that you end up losing a lot of the fine branch-like projections called dendrites. And these are they stick out from your neurons, your brain cells. They're really important. And once you lose a lot of the dendrites, they're very, very hard to recover. And it's so sad, because the frontal cortex is also the only brain region that could advise a person against working too hard, because it's the seat of like good judgment and our ability to think things through. Um, and as in addition to that, we know that overwork shrinks the hippocampus. This is a region really important for learning and memory, and it's one of the first regions to start to be affected by things like mild cognitive impairment and Alzheimer's disease. We know that it enlarges a region that called the amygdala, and this is really important for our fight or flight response. And that's why many overworked people feel very anxious and on edge, because they've got this enlarged amygdala as a result of overwork. And I go through a lot of the psychological stages of overwork in the book as well. It starts off as a feeling of dissatisfaction. You just, you're not satisfied with your job, but it's a manageable feeling, and so you kind of ignore it. But that then moves on to cynicism, where you feel like, well, I no longer care about my job. It's just something I've got to do. And then that then moves on to dehumanization. And that's a complete emotional hardening. It's a kind of a complete detachment from your colleagues. And
Yeah.
that leads on to feelings of hopelessness, of dread, of incompetence. that then leads to a lingering anxiety and depression. And
Yeah.
and the really worrying thing about all of these stages of overwork is that in the brain, it actually takes up to 3 years to recover from the effects of overwork and burnout.
Yeah, I don't think I've recovered yet. I was an entrepreneur. I worked, 60-hour weeks for like 20 years in or more.
Oh
Yeah.
gosh.
Well, you talk about a certain tendency that helps keep the executive mode in control, a cognitive bias known as focalism. Can you define
Hmm.
that for us?
Yeah, so focalism is a really interesting phenomenon where it's basically when people expect a certain situation to be a certain way. So it's usually when people focus too much on the negative aspects of things.
Right.
So it relates to a really interesting study. Well, I relate that term to a really interesting study in the book done in Japan and the UK, where they looked at a large group of students and they said, okay, we're gonna put all of you in a room and you're not going to have your smartphones and you're not going to have any other distractions. And we're just going to tell you that we just want you to just think, to sit on a chair and just think, let your mind wander and have no other distractions. And they asked all of the participants before the study, you know, what do you think it's going to be like? Like, what are you expecting from this study? And, it's no surprise, but none of them thought it would be like a riotous event. They all
Yeah.
thought it would be really boring. But that's because of this phenomenon of focalism. They were expecting it to be negative, to be dull, to be uninteresting. But
Right.
then after the study, the most fascinating thing about the result is that they all came out saying how enriching, how cognitively enriching and edifying and enlightening the experience of just thinking was.
Huh?
And so they'd allowed focalism to distract them from the actual true experience of just being allowed
Which
to
is
have their own.
probably what we do so often in general.
Yeah.
I think this is a general tendency, and it's why people catastrophize and they're so anxious. Let's talk about some of on the more positive side. You have a lot of antidotes to overwork and to help people tune into the default mode network of doing nothing. One of them we talked about was daydreaming. I like daydreaming. That's kind of fun, especially if you don't have to feel guilty about it. Uh, and so you call that mind wandering, and you have a whole chapter on that. And then there's forest bathing and the science of tree hugging. Okay, so you're reporting on quite a bit of research that was done in Japan and other places about this whole concept of taking a walk in the green space.
Yeah, it's super interesting. So we know that when you spend time in green space, so it doesn't have to be a forest, it can be a park, it can be your garden, it can be just a small patch of greenery. But we know now that when you do that, your brain waves actually shift from very busy and anxious beta waves to much more calming and creative alpha waves and even meditative theta waves. And we think that part of the reason that happens is because when you're outside, you're actually exposed to these plant chemicals called phytoncides. And they're basically natural oils that protect plants from bacteria, but you basically breathe them in, and they have an incredible effect in terms of boosting your immune system. So there have been studies showing that if you spend a few days camping, for instance, you can boost your immune system using these phytoncide chemicals by as much as 40%, and that actually lasts a month after you then leave the woods. But really, there are so many uh, fascinating cognitive benefits from spending time in nature. So we know as well that spending time in nature improves creativity and problem solving ability by as much as 50%. It even increases things like memory recall by as much as 20%. And this is in comparison to like looking at people who spend time in urban environments. And really, what this new neuroscience is teaching us is that, our brains are craving the outdoors like never before. Even if you show the brain a virtual image of an out of the outside world of nature of a green space versus an urban setting, even then it will activate the default network, and it will start to, improve in ways that we're only just beginning to understand.
Uh-huh. Well, there's two more topics that take up a lot of a chapter in the book. Actually, three more: play and exercise and sleep. And we've only got about 5 more minutes, so I'm going to let you speak to any one of those three um, in closing.
Great. Yeah, so I'll start with sleep because I really want to get across the importance of a 30-minute nap. So some really interesting research at University College London done in the last few years showed that people who take a 30-minute nap actually have larger every day, have larger brains than people who don't. And the difference is really significant. They found that it was 15 cubic centimeters, which to put in context is the volume of a small plum. So, if you think about all of the neurons and synapses and cognitive abilities and cognitive potential that is contained in that space, it's really huge. And so, I really want people to take take it as as well as having many more breaks throughout the day to activate your default network, as well as mind wandering and walking in nature and all the other things I discuss in the book. It's really important to get that 30-minute nap in every single day. You mentioned play, so I'm really want to encourage people to find micro moments of play throughout their day because play is really interesting, right? Because by definition, it's task off, it's a restful activity, but
Mhm.
we know that play has a really powerful effect on what we call the neuroplasticity of the brain, its ability to reorganize itself in response to changing situations and even in response to disease and things like
And you
that.
you have some words of praise for video games, which I found, unusual these days.
I do, yeah. The key is in moderation. So, I mean, I recommend about 30, no more than 30 minutes, although the official recommendations say that you can do 1 to 2 hours a day and you're still within the realms of sort of healthy brain activity. But I think 30 minutes a day is fine. There's so many studies now show that, yeah, small amounts of video games are really good for your brain. It's good for your spatial memory, navigation, planning, organization. One of my favorite studies was one where they looked at people who played Super Mario Brothers on the Nintendo DS for half an hour a day for 2 months. And they actually found an increase in their gray matter, their nerve cell bodies, in all of these regions associated with spatial navigation and planning and organization. So, don't dismiss video games as like, bad for you. In moderation, they can be really, really good for your brain.
What kind of advice would you give people in terms of how do we differentiate within ourselves between the default network and the executive network? Because they're both involved with thinking.
Hmm.
And,
Yeah.
so how do we know which one we're in? Wouldn't it be great?
Mm.
I mean, I would love to have my Apple Watch tell me what kind of brain waves I'm dealing with right now. I have a device that can tell me the glucose in my blood, but I would like if we could see
Yeah.
that in the
Well, yeah, the good thing about it is that because they actually work in competition with each other. So when your executive network is active, your default network is actually fairly quiet, and vice versa. And you know when you're in executive network mode because it's anything that feels cognitively exerting. It's that feeling you have when you're doing work and
right,
it's straining for your brain. It's demanding a lot of focus, a lot of attention, and it's providing cognitive fatigue. You can really feel when you're in pure executive network mode.
right,
And at the same time, you can really feel when you're just on a beach looking at the lapping waves when you're in your default network mode.
right. Yeah, I think that when you start getting really tired, you're probably in executive mode from too much concentration or something. Um,
Mm.
I'm going to quote something from your book now. We've only got a couple minutes. And it goes like this. In a quiet study in London one day in 1934, the philosopher Bertrand Russell penned an essay that would become a timeless reflection on work and rest. It was titled In Praise of Idleness. Idleness, scholars have explained, was more akin to what we would today consider leisure or play. And he's quoted as saying, the morality of work was the morality of slaves, and the modern world has no need of slavery. Wow, there's a revolutionary sentiment, if ever there were one. It-
Yeah, well, he was ahead of his time in so many ways. At
right.
the rate we're overworking and the statistics of burnout, he wasn't far off. We need a radical shift for our brain health in terms of how much
Well,
we work.
well, we've got 1 minute left, Joseph. I'm going to offer it to you for some final words of advice to our audience.
Great. So yeah, final words of advice. I just want to get the message across to people that, when you're resting, you and when you're seemingly doing nothing, your brain is doing an awful lot of something. And so many of the cognitive abilities that, that you cherish, like your improved memory and your problem solving and your creativity and all the things that help you in your long-term productivity, that help you achieve your goals and flourish. Those are coming from your resting brain, not your working brain. As I say in the book, what this new neuroscience is teaching us is that people often succeed in life not despite their inactivity, but because of it. So please embrace rest for your brain, guilt-free, because the science of it is really quite extraordinary.
There's quite a bit of overlap in terms of the advice that you're giving in the book I wrote called Intuitive Intelligence, where I'm making the point you can't force intuition. You have to let it happen. And that's kind of
Mm,
maybe a default mode skill. That would be another conversation that maybe we could have someday. But I want to thank you,
absolutely.
Joseph. There's so much more we could explore today, but we've run out of time. And I want to make sure to tell our listeners about your website, which is drjosephjebelli.com. All one word, Dr. Joseph Jebelli, Jebelli.com. And for those who may have tuned in to Pathways late, this is Paul O'Brien, author of Intuitive Intelligence, a book that shares the theme of pathways, which is personal and cultural evolution. Now, don't worry, you can play and or share this interview whenever you want via the internet or as a free podcast, and I'll tell you how in a minute. Today, we've been visiting with Dr. Joseph Jebelli, author of The Brain at Rest, How the Art and Science of Doing Nothing Can Improve Your Life. I want to say a heartfelt thank you to all of you listeners for tuning into Pathways, which is broadcast on KBOO FM in Portland, Oregon. Or perhaps you subscribe to the podcast version for free, which you can find at divination.com. That's spelled DIVI nation.com, as well as by searching for Pathways Radio on Paulo's YouTube channel, where you can give us a thumbs up and subscribe. And please feel free to forward a link to your friends. This is Paulo bidding you adieu and reminding you to tell your friends about Pathways podcasts. And thanks again to Dr. Joseph Jebelli and to all of you listeners for tuning in and being a part of the Pathways conversation.